Officer David Mercer was the last cop who tried to patrol the Hawthorne Hill tunnel after sunset, and when his backup found him 3 hours later, he was sitting in the middle of the road with his service weapon emptied into the concrete walls, his hair turned completely white, and his voice reduced to a whisper that repeated the same 7 words until the day he died in the psychiatric ward 17 months later. The words he kept saying were that the children are still burning inside, and the department buried his report so deep that even Freedom of Information requests returned nothing but redacted pages and a note, suggesting the file was lost in a clerical error that nobody believes actually happened. The tunnel beneath Hawthorne Hill was constructed in 1927 to connect 2 growing neighborhoods that the geography of the land had kept separated for generations. The engineers who designed it warned the city council that the location was unsuitable, that the soil composition was wrong, that water would seep through the walls and create structural problems within decades. But the council was determined to proceed, driven by economic interests and political pressure from developers who had already sold homes on both sides of the hill. Construction began in March despite the warnings, and by September the tunnel was complete and open to traffic. The first incident occurred less than a month after the tunnel opened, when a mother driving her 3 children home from a church picnic reported that her car had stalled in the exact center of the passage. She told police that the temperature inside the tunnel dropped so suddenly that frost formed on her windows, despite the autumn warmth outside. She said she heard children laughing from somewhere in the darkness beyond her headlights, children whose voices did not belong to her own kids, who had gone silent in the back seat with expressions of terror she had never seen on their faces before. Her car started again after 7 minutes, and she drove home without stopping, refusing to answer her children's questions about what had happened. The police report from that night was brief and dismissive, attributing the incident to engine trouble and maternal hysteria. But the officer who took her statement added a handwritten note at the bottom of the page that was not discovered until decades later. The note said that he had driven through the tunnel himself that evening and had heard the same laughter the woman described, coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off walls that should not have been able to produce such sounds. The tunnel earned its nickname gradually over the following years, as more and more drivers reported hearing screams that seemed to emanate from the concrete itself. The screams were always described the same way, high-pitched and desperate, belonging to multiple children whose agony was evident even through the distortion of the tunnel's strange acoustics. Some drivers reported seeing figures in their rearview mirrors, small shapes that vanished when they turned to look directly. Others described the sensation of hands pressing against their windows from outside, leaving prints that appeared to be burned into the glass rather than merely smudged upon it. The city commissioned an investigation in 1934, sending engineers back into the tunnel to examine its construction and determine if some acoustic anomaly might explain the reported phenomena. The engineers spent 3 days taking measurements and testing theories, working only during daylight hours at their own insistence. Their final report attributed the screaming sounds to wind passing through microscopic cracks in the tunnel walls, creating a phenomenon similar to the way breath passing through a whistle produces sound. This explanation satisfied exactly no one, particularly since the screams continued even on days when no wind blew. What the official investigation failed to mention, what the city council worked very hard to ensure never became public knowledge, was what workers had discovered during the original construction. Excavation crews breaking through the hill had uncovered a system of caves that appeared to extend deep into the earth, caves whose walls were covered in markings that predated any known indigenous habitation of the region. More disturbing still were the remains they found in those caves. Small skeletons arranged in circles around central chambers, dozens of them in various stages of preservation, all of them belonging to children who could not have been older than 10. The construction company sealed the caves with concrete and continued building, pouring their tunnel directly through what appeared to have been a site of ritualistic sacrifice stretching back centuries or perhaps millennia. The workers who handled the bones were sworn to secrecy and paid substantial bonuses for their silence. But several of them would later report nightmares that plagued them until death, dreams of standing in darkness while small figures approached with arms outstretched, their flesh blackened and smoking, their mouths open in screams that the dreamers could feel in their chests long after waking. The tunnel claimed its first official victim in 1941, when a truck carrying industrial chemicals lost control inside the passage and crashed into the wall with enough force to rupture its tanks. The resulting fire burned for 6 hours, reaching temperatures high enough to damage the structural integrity of the concrete and forcing the city to close the tunnel for 3 months of repairs. What made this accident noteworthy was not the fire itself, but what firefighters reported seeing in the flames, small figures that seemed to dance in the inferno, shapes that moved against the direction of the fire as if welcoming the heat rather than fleeing it. The repair crews who rebuilt the damaged section refused to work after sunset, citing safety concerns that their supervisors knew had nothing to do with visibility or overtime regulations. 3 workers quit during the project, each one submitting resignation letters that mentioned personal reasons without elaboration. One of them, a man named Harold Jennings, was found dead in his home 2 weeks after leaving the job, having apparently barricaded himself in his bedroom and died of dehydration rather than open his door. His journal, discovered by police, contained page after page of the same phrase written in increasingly erratic handwriting. He wrote that they want me to come back. They say I took something that belongs to them. They are outside my door, and they smell like burning. The decades that followed brought a steady accumulation of incidents that the police department documented with increasing reluctance. Cars broke down in the tunnel with mechanical problems that disappeared once the vehicles were towed outside. Drivers reported losing time, entering the tunnel at one moment and emerging to find that hours had passed without their awareness. Pedestrians who attempted to walk through the passage described feeling hands grabbing at their ankles, small fingers that left bruises in the shape of children's grips. And always the screaming continued, that chorus of young voices crying out in agony that no acoustic explanation could adequately address. Officer Mercer's breakdown in 1987 finally forced the department to acknowledge what individual officers had known for decades. He had been a 15-year veteran with commendations for bravery and a reputation for steady nerves in crisis situations. He volunteered to patrol the tunnel specifically because he did not believe the stories, because he wanted to prove that superstition had no place in modern law enforcement. His partner refused to accompany him, accepting a formal reprimand rather than enter the tunnel after dark, and Mercer drove in alone at 9:47 on a November evening with his radio on and his windows rolled up tight. The radio recording from that night was played once at the internal review hearing before being classified and locked away with Mercer's file. It captured 43 minutes of audio that began with Mercer's routine position reports and ended with sounds that the audio technicians could not explain. His voice grew increasingly strained as the minutes passed, his professional tone cracking as he described seeing figures in his headlights that vanished when he approached. He reported that his car had stalled, that his flashlight had failed, that he could hear children laughing and then screaming and then speaking in a language he did not recognize directly into his ear, despite his windows being closed. The final transmission was Mercer screaming himself, his voice joining the chorus he had been sent to debunk. 12 gunshots firing in rapid succession, followed by a silence that lasted 7 minutes before his radio activated one final time. The sound that emerged from that transmission has never been officially described, but 3 of the officers who heard it during the review hearing requested immediate transfers to other jurisdictions, and one of them never returned to law enforcement at all. They found Mercer sitting in the road outside the tunnel, his car still inside with all 4 doors open, his ammunition expended into walls that showed no bullet holes despite the close range. The department stopped assigning solo patrols to the Hawthorne Hill area after Mercer's breakdown, and within a year they stopped patrolling it entirely after sunset. The official policy was never written down, never formally acknowledged, but every officer who worked at the surrounding beats understood without being told. The tunnel existed outside their jurisdiction after dark, belonging to something that had claimed it long before the city built roads through its territory. Calls for service in that area after sunset were handled by directing callers to wait until morning or seek alternative routes to their destinations. The tunnel remained open to public traffic, the city having no legal justification for closing a functional roadway based on reports that officials refused to validate. But locals learned to avoid it, passing down warnings through generations the way their ancestors had passed down warnings about the caves beneath the hill before anyone knew the caves existed. Tourists and newcomers occasionally drove through after dark, and most of them emerged unharmed, shaken, but unable to articulate exactly what had frightened them so badly. The tunnel seemed to choose its victims selectively, reaching out to some while allowing others to pass unmolested. The connection between the buried bones and the tunnel's phenomena was finally established by a graduate student named Patricia Okafor, who stumbled upon the original construction records while researching local history in 2015. Her thesis documenting the discovery and cover-up was rejected by her university, officially because of methodological concerns, but actually because of pressure from city officials who still had reasons to keep the truth hidden. Patricia published her findings independently online, where they spread through paranormal research communities and attracted the attention of investigators who had been studying similar locations around the world. These investigators proposed a theory that made terrible sense of everything that had happened beneath Hawthorne Hill. They suggested that the caves had been a site of sacrifice for a belief system that predated recorded history, a place where children were offered to something that existed in the dark spaces beneath the earth. The rituals performed there had created a wound in reality that never properly healed, a location where the boundary between the living world and something else remained permanently thin. The tunnel had torn that wound wider, and the fire of 1941 had provided energy that the entities trapped within had been able to use. The screaming, the investigators theorized, was not a recording or a haunting, in the traditional sense. It was the sound of sacrifices still being performed outside of time, echoes of agony that continued endlessly because whatever received those offerings existed in a state where past and present had no meaning. The children who had died in those caves were still dying, their suffering eternal and ongoing, and the tunnel provided a conduit through which the living could briefly perceive what had always been happening in the darkness beneath their feet. A group of paranormal researchers attempted to investigate the tunnel in 2019, setting up equipment and cameras inside the passage at midnight on the anniversary of the 1941 fire. Their live stream attracted thousands of viewers who watched as the team's instruments began malfunctioning one by one, as temperatures dropped to levels that frosted the camera lenses, as sounds emerged from the concrete that no skeptic could explain away. The stream ended abruptly when all lights in the tunnel extinguished simultaneously, and the final frame captured something that has been analyzed and debated endlessly in the years since. The image shows the research team frozen in positions of apparent terror, and behind them, illuminated by the camera's failing night vision, stand dozens of small figures with arms outstretched and mouths open in screams that the audio captured in frequencies below human hearing. Their forms appear burned, blackened, with eyes that reflect the infrared light in ways that should not be physically possible. They stand in a semicircle around the researchers, and they appear to be waiting for something, their posture suggesting patience rather than immediate threat. The research team emerged from the tunnel 27 minutes later with no memory of what had happened after the stream ended. Their equipment was found inside, melted into shapeless masses of plastic and metal that retained heat for hours after being removed. Each team member bore identical marks on their ankles, small handprints burned into the skin that matched the size of children between 6 and 8 years old. They have refused all interviews and declined to participate in any further investigations, communicating through lawyers that they consider the matter closed and wish to move on with their lives. The Hawthorne Hill Tunnel remains open today, carrying traffic between neighborhoods that have no other convenient connection. Most drivers pass through without incident, aware of the tunnel's reputation, but experiencing nothing unusual during their brief transit. The screaming comes only occasionally now, perhaps because whatever resides within has grown weaker, or perhaps because it has grown selective, waiting for specific individuals whose presence triggers its eternal hunger. Local police still avoid the tunnel after sunset, their unofficial policy now an open secret that no one in authority will confirm or deny. On certain nights, residents of the neighborhoods on either side of the hill report power fluctuations that coincide with moments of unusual silence, as if something is drawing energy from the world above to fuel activities below. Children in the area sometimes wake from nightmares they cannot describe, crying about friends they met in dreams who want them to come play in the dark. And occasionally, very occasionally, a driver enters the tunnel after sunset and never emerges from the other side, their car found abandoned in the morning, with doors open and engine still running, the interior filled with the smell of smoke and something older. The bones beneath the tunnel remain sealed in their concrete tomb, waiting with patience measured in millennia for the next opportunity to add to their number. The rituals that put them there may have ended centuries ago, but the appetite they fed has never diminished. It merely waits, patient and eternal, reaching up through layers of earth and stone to touch a world that has forgotten why it should be afraid. The screaming continues in frequencies most ears cannot perceive, a chorus of suffering that has lasted longer than human civilization and shows no signs of ever reaching its end. If you must drive through the Hawthorne Hill tunnel after sunset, keep your windows closed and your eyes forward. Do not stop for any reason, regardless of what you hear or what appears in your mirrors. Do not speak aloud because something is listening that has learned to remember voices and faces. And if your car stalls in the darkness at the center of that passage, if you find yourself surrounded by silence that feels alive with anticipation, pray that you are not the one they have been waiting for. Because the children beneath the hill are always hungry, and their patience has no limit, and they have been burning in the dark for longer than anyone can imagine.